My wife and I were with the churches in Jackson, Mississippi and Laurel, Mississippi this past Sabbath, and bring you greetings from over there. It's been a very encouraging year, particularly for the church in Jackson. They've had a number of new people who have begun attending there in the course of, I guess, well, since around the first of the year. That sort of an extended family that, as a result of the telecast, and there have been several of them who have been baptized now in recent months, and I guess others who are counseling for baptism. So that was very enjoyable, and to be in Laurel as well. It's good to be back here with all of you. We're here on the Day of Atonement, a day that is different, of course, than the other festivals that we celebrate. Normally, when you think of a feast, you think of sitting down and, digging in. The Day of Atonement, of course, is a little different. It's a little different in several ways. It's interesting that July the 4th, 1776, in Philadelphia, there was a bell atop the old State House there in Philadelphia that was rung to announce the Declaration of Independence of the United States. Now, one of the things that was particularly interesting, this bell, of course, is known as the Liberty Bell. And most people think, well, that's because it was rung to announce the independence of the United States. It proclaimed the Declaration of Independence, which was signed there at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. But that's not really why this bell is known as the Liberty Bell. This bell had been initially cast in a foundry in England about 25 years earlier. And the reason it was called the Liberty Bell was because it had a particular inscription that is inscribed upon this bell. The inscription comes from Leviticus 25. And the inscription is from Leviticus 25:10. You shall proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. That's the inscription on the bell. That's why it's called the Liberty Bell. Now, it's interesting because that inscription, this proclamation of liberty, you may say, well, what does that have to do with us? What does that proclamation of liberty so many years ago, what does that have to do with us today? Well, let's note here in Leviticus 25, and then let's understand the connection with this day upon which we are now congregated before God. God instructed Moses in Mount Sinai, Leviticus 25:1, that he was to speak unto the children of Israel and to tell them that when they came into the land, they were to allow the land to keep a Sabbath. 6 years they would sow the field, and 6 years prune the vines, but the 7th year would be a Sabbath of rest unto the land. And then they were told in verse 8, you shall number 7 Sabbaths of years unto you, 7 times 7 years. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto you 49 years. Now that's just like we count for Pentecost, 7 Sabbaths. Here they were to count 7 Sabbaths of years, so that would be 49 years. Verse 9, you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall you make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. And you shall proclaim the 50th year. And you shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a jubilee unto you. You shall return every man unto his possession. You shall return every man unto his family. A jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. You shall neither sow, neither reap that which grows of itself in it, nor gather the grapes of your vine undressed. It is the Jubilee, it shall be holy unto you. You shall eat the increase thereof out of the field. In the year of this Jubilee you shall return every man unto his possession. The 50th year was hallowed as the Jubilee. liberty was to be proclaimed throughout all the land. Those who were in servitude, who were enslaved, were freed at the Jubilee and were allowed to go back. Land that had been sold, family property, reverted back to the original owners. Everything went back at the 50th year. The land lay fallow. It was a time of rest for the land. It was also a time of liberty, a time of an economic fresh start for everyone in the entire nation. Now, normally when you think of proclaiming something of this sort, you would think of starting it when the year started, or if you were going to start it in the fall, because they were, from a practical standpoint, the time to start something is after the harvest, which occurred in the fall. And they had harvested, and now it was a new agricultural year. But let me pose a question to you. Why was not the trumpet of the Jubilee sounded on the Feast of Trumpets? That was the first day of the 7th month. That would seem, you're going to start something in the 7th month. That would seem like that would be the time. You started on the first day of the month in the Feast of Trumpets. But the Jubilee was not proclaimed on the Feast of Trumpets. The Jubilee was not proclaimed until 9 days later on the Day of Atonement. It was on the Day of Atonement that the trumpet of Jubilee sounded. The trumpet of Jubilee sounded, and the Jubilee was proclaimed. It was done on the Day of Atonement. This very day that we are here celebrating, the Day of Atonement. Now, the Jubilee looked forward to an event. The time when the real Jubilee is going to be proclaimed is going to be a few years ahead of us when Jesus Christ returns, because that's when finally liberty will be proclaimed throughout all the world. The whole earth will have liberty proclaimed to it. People will be regathered to their family heritage. God divided to the nations their inheritance, we're told in the book of Deuteronomy. The eternal God separated the sons of Adam. He divided to the nations their inheritance. Down through time, we have, all the way down to our day, we've got all these problems. All sorts of ethnic strife. Christ alludes to that in Matthew 24 when he talks about nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. The word for nation is ethnos. We've got, in addition to national, multinational contests going on, we've got ethnic strife. You've got it in Africa, you've got it in Asia, you've got it in Europe, you've got it all over the world. Well, the time is going to come when liberty will truly be proclaimed, when people will be able to be regathered to their heritage, to their homeland, as it were, and none will make them afraid. No bigger neighbor is going to be coming in, coveting what they have and taking it away from them. But that proclamation is going to be on the Day of Atonement, to proclaim liberty. Why is that on the Day of Atonement? Let's just notice, let's go back a couple of pages here to Leviticus 23 and notice a little bit about this Day of Atonement. Now, in Leviticus 23:23, the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, in the first day of the month, shall you have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation." We had that just over a week ago. "You shall do no servile work therein." They made offerings at the tabernacle and later at the temple. And then in verse 27, "On the 10th day of this 7th month, there shall be a day of atonement. It shall be a holy convocation unto you, and you shall afflict your souls, and offer an offering made by fire." Now we understand that in those sacrifices there was a remembrance made from year to year, but Jesus Christ came as the Lamb of God to take away the sins of the world. By the shedding of the blood of bulls and goats, as we're told in the book of Hebrews, there is no remission of sin. That whole sacrificial system was something that was added because of their disobedience, and that was added, and was a part of the situation, of the system, until Christ came. God inspired Jeremiah to write in Jeremiah 7:22, I spoke not unto your fathers, nor commanded them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices. But this thing commanded I them, saying, Obey my voice, and I'll be your God, and you'll be my people, and walk you in all the ways that I've commanded you, that it may be well unto you. But they hearken not, nor incline their ear. God did not originally speak to Israel concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices, but as you read the account there in the book of Exodus, you read of Israel's sin in building the golden calf after Moses was in the mount, after the Ten Commandments had been given, after the Old Covenant had been made. And so the whole Levitical structure was set up, and these offerings were made. Offerings weren't just made on the holy days. Some say, well, the holy days don't apply today because we don't have offerings. Offerings were made every day of the year, every morning and every evening. If doing away with the sacrifices, the sacrificial system did away with the holy days, it does away with every day. The sacrifices were offered every morning and every evening. And there were additional sacrifices offered on the Sabbath and offered on the new moons, offered on the high days, offered on any number of special occasions. That was what was temporarily added as a schoolmaster. The Ten Commandments and God had begun giving the holy days before He brought them out of Egypt. You remember, He instructed them about the days of the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. That predated even the giving of the Old Covenant. These things were in force and effect. On this Day of Atonement, we are to have a holy convocation, and we are to afflict our souls. Verse 28, You shall do no work in that day. It is the Day of Atonement, to make an atonement for you before the eternal your God. Whatsoever soul it shall be that shall not be afflicted in that same day, he shall be cut off from among his people. And whatsoever soul it be that does any work in that same day, the same soul will I destroy from among my people. You shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever, throughout your generations and all your dwellings. It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and you shall afflict your souls. In the 9th day of the month at evening, from evening to evening, shall you celebrate your Sabbath. So we find here this Day of Atonement. It is a day in which we're told to afflict our souls. That is used in Scripture to refer to fasting. We afflict our soul, or humble our soul, through fasting. Now, in addition, there was a particular ceremony that was alluded to earlier by Mr. Smith that we find back in Leviticus 16 that was carried out on the Day of Atonement. And Aaron was told that, recorded here in Leviticus 16, in verse 3, Thus shall Aaron come into the holy place, and how he was to come. And he's to put on these special garments, and he goes through with the offerings that he personally was to take or was to make. And then in verse 7, he was to take 2 goats, present them before the Eternal at the door of the tabernacle, cast lots on the 2 goats. One was chosen for the Eternal, and the other was for Azazel. I might mention this word scapegoat that we have translated in the King James, and that's come into common usage. When you say use the word scapegoat in modern English, it refers to someone who is sort of unfairly borne the blame for everyone else. He had all the blame put on him. He's sort of got in trouble for what everybody else did. It's interesting how this particular word in English has developed. The translators of the King James were unclear how to translate Azazel, and instead of just listing it as a proper name, they gave not really a translation but an interpretation. This was the goat that escaped. In Old English, the term scapegoat was a form of escape goat, and it just meant the goat that escaped. Well, because of a misunderstanding of what this whole ceremony was about, the term scapegoat came to mean in English, as a result of the King James translation, the word scapegoat came to mean in English somebody that unfairly got the blame rather than the one that escaped. It simply is a development of the usage of the word. People now, when you say scapegoat, no one thinks of escaping; they think of the very opposite. But the Azazel, which is the Hebrew term, would better be rendered here just as a proper name. And the Jews have traditionally understood that represented Satan. They bring that out and understand that, have as understanding, that's always been their understanding of the ceremony. Aaron brought the goats before God, and before the door of the tabernacle, lots were cast, and now a distinction was made between the two goats. The goat that was chosen for the Lord was offered for a sin offering. And Aaron took the blood into the Holy of Holies. This was the one time in the year that he was permitted to come behind the curtain, to come before the Ark of the Covenant, before the mercy seat, and to sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat. To, in that sense, to bring the sacrifice before God, to heaven itself. Then the goat that had been chosen for Azazel, that one was left alive. And that goat, we're told, was taken, and in the hand of a fit man, as it said, that down in verse 21 of Leviticus 16, Aaron shall lay both his hands upon the head of the live goat and confess over him all the iniquities of the children of Israel and all their transgressions and all their sins, putting them upon the head of the goat, and send him away by the hand of a fit man into the wilderness. And the goat shall bear upon him all their iniquities unto a land not inhabited. He shall let go the goat in the wilderness. So here is a goat that was taken out into an uninhabited area, that was exiled, as it were. But prior to that, now Aaron has already offered the sin offering. He's already taken the blood of the goat into the Holy of Holies, into the very presence of the ark. He has sprinkled it on the mercy seat. But that's not the end of it. The other goat had hands laid on. He was set apart to bear responsibility for all the sins of the nation. And then he was taken out and into a desolate area, into a wilderness. Now, when you go through the Scriptures, we find that Jesus Christ gave himself as a sacrifice for us. Aaron, the symbolism here, the goat that was chosen for God, that was sacrificed there before the tabernacle, that was representative of Jesus Christ. Then Aaron, as high priest, taking the blood, represented the living Jesus Christ, the resurrected Christ, who came before the Father and who was accepted before the Father and whose sacrifice was accepted in payment of sin. But that's not the end of the story. Because where did sin originate? Who ultimately must bear responsibility? We find that the Azazel goat was to bear responsibility and to be taken out into the wilderness. Now, back in Revelation chapter 20, we find that right after Jesus Christ returns to this earth, as is described in Revelation 19, in Revelation 20, verse 1, I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the great abyss, the bottomless pit, as it's translated, and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan. And he bound him 1,000 years, and he cast him into the great abyss. And he shut him up and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that he must be loosed a little season. You know, the fit man laying hands on this goat and taking it out into a wilderness exile was a type of an event that is going to happen in the future when Satan the devil is going to be taken and put in a wilderness exile, in a great abyss, a great pit, and is going to be restrained there. Is not going to be allowed to deceive the nations anymore. Now, we're here celebrating that day of atonement. Let's go on a little bit. We looked at Leviticus chapter 25 and at what is involved there as far as the Jubilee that is to be proclaimed. They were to proclaim liberty. So it was a release of slaves. They were to let the land rest. Property was to come back to the original owners. When we look at all the problems on the face of the earth right now, we look at all of the pain and the suffering, people being uprooted, you look at the terrible situations as people find themselves in all over the world. You realize the time is coming when there is going to be a solution to those problems. The Feast of Trumpets, as we saw, represents the intervention of God, God's judgment that will culminate with the return of Jesus Christ. But after Christ returns, the next event will be the events of the Day of Atonement. Now we're going to see what those things involve. First, let's look a little bit at the spiritual implication of this event for us. When we go back to Genesis 3, we find the introduction of sin to human beings. Genesis 3 introduces us to the serpent, Satan, the devil, who confronts Adam and Eve in the garden. He said unto the woman, Genesis 3:1, "Has God said that you can't eat of the trees here in the garden?" And of course the woman entered into dialogue. She said, "Oh, well, we can eat the tree, we can eat the fruit, except for this one over here, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the one here in the midst of the garden." Well, the serpent told the woman, "You shall not surely die." Oh, no, you won't die. Well, the woman, verse 6, saw that the tree was good for food. She saw. It looked good. It was enticing to the eyes. She saw that it was good. It was pleasant to the eyes. It was good for food. It was pleasant to the eyes. It was a tree to be desired to make one wise. Now, what did Satan appeal to? Well, he appealed to the lusts of the flesh, the appetites of the flesh. It was good for food. It's going to taste good. You know, I could stand up here and describe something that was good for food right now and sort of whet your appetite. It was good for food. It was appealed to the lust of the flesh, the desires of the flesh. You know, as the course of this day goes on, your mouth begins to get a little dry, and you really would desire to have something to drink. You would desire to have something to eat, you know. Chances are most of us, by the time we get to sunset this evening, are not going to say, well, you know, this was so easy, I think I'll just go for another few days. You're probably going to be glad, well, you know, I can have a glass of water, I can have something to eat. What was appealed to here in Genesis 3? It was good for food. It was pleasant to the eyes. It looked good. You know, something can appeal to our physical appetites, what the Bible calls the lust of the flesh. It can appeal to the eyes. There are things we look at, and they look enticing, and we like the looks of it. It was pleasant to the eyes. It was pretty. And it was a tree to be desired to make one wise. Satan said, if you eat this, you'll be like God. That's why God doesn't want you to have it. Oh, the pride of life. Now, in 1 John chapter 2, John says, all that is in the world, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passes away, and he that does the lust thereof. So the Apostle John brings out in 1 John 2 that the entire world is built upon lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. What was appealed to with Eve right here in the garden? What was appealed to for the first sin? Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. It was good for food, pleasant to the eyes, to be desired to make one wise. What are we doing on the Day of Atonement? We're not entertaining the lusts of the flesh. In fact, we are rejecting what our flesh desires. Because what our flesh naturally desires is food and water. And God says, here's a day for you to afflict your soul. Here's a day that you set apart and that you demonstrate. You see, what we're doing, in effect, is we are reversing the process that our first parents engaged in right here in Genesis 3. Fasting is a tool to humble ourselves, right? We humble our soul with fasting. Not a whole lot of the pride of life left when you're sort of dragging your tail between your legs. You're rejecting the pulls of the flesh, the pulls of the eyes. You know, you look. We'll pass out here downstairs during the noon hour, and you sort of look over there into the dining room. You know, the smell sort of waft across, and you notice all these folks, they're sitting in there eating. And you look over there, boy, that looks pretty good. Smells good, looks good. But you see, what we're saying by what we do today is there's something more important to us than feeding the flesh. There's something more important to us than fulfilling the desire of the eyes. There's something more important to us than the pride of life. We are rejecting the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, and are saying that God's Word and God's way means more to us than the very things that were appealed to by our first parents. You know, if you go to the temptation of Jesus Christ, what did Satan appeal to? Well, he appealed to the lust of the flesh, didn't he? He said, take these stones and turn them into bread. Now, right before that, we're told that Jesus had been fasting for 40 days and he was very hungry. And Satan said, look, just turn the stones into bread. Jesus Christ refused to be enticed by the pulls of the flesh. Satan then, in a moment of time, showed him all the kingdoms of this world. And he said, all of this is mine. And if you'll worship me, I'll give it to you. He showed him something. You see, the lust of the eyes. You see all of the glory and the grandeur, all of the great things. And he says, here's a shortcut. Then he told him, he said, look, if you be the Son of Man, if you are the Son of God. You know, the Scripture says he won't allow your foot to dash upon a stone. Why don't you go up here on the spire of the temple and jump off and let the angels catch you on the way down, and that way everybody will see. That's sort of an appeal to the pride of life. You know, just really show out for everybody. Do this great thing and just jump off and let all the angels come gather you up. You see, Jesus Christ refused to be enticed by the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. Eve was enticed by those things, and Adam just sort of went along. They were enticed by those pulls. That is the basis of our whole society. That's what Satan appealed to way back then with our first parents, and that's what he continues to appeal to all the way down till today. On this day, in a very special way, our attention is focused on a rejection of having our lives governed by the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. We are rejecting the things that dominate and govern and determine this whole world, this whole society. Have you ever seen an advertisement that was not based on either lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, or the pride of life? I'm not saying that there's not any, but I can't think of one right off. That's what's appealed to. That's what's appealed to. Why else would you have, this big, rugged, masculine-looking cowboy riding across the range, and he's selling cigarettes? Now, what does Marlboro have to do with the, people don't identify with the, what they identify with. Boy, here's this big, rugged guy, and I'd like to be like that. It appeals. Lust of the eyes, pride of life. So Satan set in motion the basis of human society here in Genesis 3. And for 6,000 years, an entire society has been based on the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Jesus Christ rejected being governed by those things. He refused to yield to Satan's enticement and his subtlety in trying to entice Jesus Christ into being governed by the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. On this day, we, by our actions, as we come before God fasting, we demonstrate our rejection of the basis of this society and the fact that we are living our lives in anticipation of a new world, a new society that is based on something entirely different. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. That our drink is the Spirit of God. Living waters. The waters that if a man drink of, he shall never thirst. Our food is the Word of God. Our sustenance comes from God, and that's what we're focused on. Now, what we find in Genesis 3 is after sin came into the world, there were consequences of sin. There was a sense of shame and guilt that came over Adam and Eve. And they hid themselves from God. They were ashamed, and so they hid. Man took the first step in cutting himself off from God. Then God dealt with Adam and Eve, and He told them that there were consequences that would come. That there would be sorrow. That there would be many obstacles and difficulties to overcome. Thorns and thistles will the earth bring forth. And Adam was told in verse 19, "In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, dust you are, and to dust you shall return." So we find that there was sorrow, there was pain, there was hard labor and effort that would culminate in death. And so we've lived in a world for 6,000 years that has been dominated by these things. It has been a world of pain, a world of sorrow, a world of hard labor, ultimately ending in death, returning to the dust from whence we came. But you see, God has a plan and a purpose that stretches on beyond that. In Romans chapter 5, we'll pick it up in verse 8. "But God commends His love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, being now justified by His blood, we shall be saved from wrath through Him. For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of His Son, much more, being reconciled, we shall be saved by His life. And not only so, but we also joy in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom we have now received the atonement." Jesus Christ is the means of our atonement. "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for all have sinned." Sin came into the world, and death came by sin, and death has passed upon all human beings. Consequences. There has been sin, there has been pain and sorrow. There has been death. Now let's go back to the book of Isaiah, chapter 59. Isaiah 59, verse 1, Behold, the Eternal's hand is not shortened that it cannot save, neither his ear heavy that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid his face from you that he will not hear. Sin comes between us and God. Sin is what caused Adam and Eve to hide from God. And it was their sin that caused God to expel them out from the garden. They were sent out from the garden away from the presence of the Lord, because iniquities separate between us and God. Sins cause God to hide his face that he will not hear. You see, we don't fast to get our way. We don't fast to get God to agree with us. We fast to bring ourselves into harmony with God, to examine ourselves, to get rid of that which separates us from God. Because when we're close to God, God hears and answers. Sin has an enslaving, impoverishing quality. Notice back in Exodus chapter 5. You see, in Exodus 5, Moses and Aaron had come before Pharaoh, and they says, Thus says the eternal God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice? I don't know the Lord, and I'm not going to let Israel go. And they said, Well, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness. And the king of Egypt told them in verse 4, end of the verse, Get you unto your burdens. And Pharaoh said, Behold, the people of the land now are many, and you make them rest from their burdens. See, Moses was offering rest, and Pharaoh didn't want the people to rest. Pharaoh commanded the same day the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, Don't give the people straw to make brick. Let them go and get the straw for themselves and not reduce the quantity of brick that they make. Coming on down in chapter 6, God says in verse 5, I have heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Wherefore say unto the children of Israel, I am the Eternal, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will rid you of their bondage, and I will redeem you with a stretched out arm and with great judgments. I will take you to me for a people, and I will be to you a God, and you shall know that I am the Eternal your God, that brings you out from under the burdens of Egypt. Israel was enslaved. Israel was impoverished. Israel was in need of deliverance, and God said, I am going to bring you out from under the burden. I'm going to bring you out from under the heavy load. I'm going to give you rest. Israel was introduced to God in the context of their inability to deliver themselves, and God's promise to do so. Notice back in Psalm 38. Psalm 38. Psalm 38, verse 1, this is a psalm of David. O Lord, rebuke me not in your wrath, neither chasten me in your hot displeasure. He goes on to say in verse 4, My iniquities are gone over my head as a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me. Israel had their physical burdens to bear in the land of Egypt. And they were bearing a heavy burden from which God promised to deliver them. But ultimately, our burden, our iniquities, are a heavy burden. They're too heavy for us to carry. The real burden that people carry through life is the burden of sin and its consequences. We live in a world that is cut off from God, that is estranged from God, a world that has gone out from the presence of God and is cut off from God because of sin. A world of sorrow, hard labor, a world of death and pain. But notice the contrast back here in Romans chapter 6. Sin is a burden. It's too heavy to be borne. But notice in Romans chapter 6, verse 1, Paul says, "What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound?" Is that what God's grace means? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? Know you not that so many of us as were baptized into Jesus Christ were baptized into His death? You're buried with Him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. If you've been planted together in the likeness of His death, we shall be also in the likeness of His resurrection. You see, as it goes on, comes on down a little bit further, in verse 11, "Likewise reckon you also yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto God through Jesus Christ our Lord. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal bodies." Let not sin rule, that you should obey it in the lust thereof. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. "Neither yield you your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin." Our eyes, our ears, our hands, our feet, our mouth, the members of our body are not to be yielded, surrendered to sin, because sin enslaves. Sin impoverishes. Sin exiles us from the presence of God. "Yield yourselves unto God," verse 13, "as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. For sin shall not have dominion over you, shall not have rulership." You're not under the law, but under grace. We are under the free gift, the unmerited pardon of God. We don't have to be ruled over by sin. "What then?" Verse 15, "Shall we sin because we're not under the law but under grace? God forbid. Know you not that to whom you yield yourselves servants to obey, His servants you are, to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness?" Verse 18, you're being made free from sin. You became the servants of righteousness. To be under sin, to be under the penalty and the consequences of sin, we are offered deliverance. Deliverance from sin and from the consequences of sin. And that will ultimately be made manifest when Jesus Christ returns and this mortal is changed into immortality. So, sin has an enslaving, impoverishing quality about it. Jesus Christ came with an offer of freedom. Now, we started out by a focus on the Liberty Bell and the inscription on it, "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land." Jesus Christ came with a proclamation of liberty. He came with an offer of freedom. Notice in Matthew chapter 11. Notice what Jesus said in verse 28. "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Now that's what Pharaoh accused Moses of trying to do for the Egyptians. He said, "You're trying to give them rest." The children of Israel were groaning because of the burdens that they bore. Jesus Christ says, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." Adam was told, "You're going to have to labor. You're going to have to labor and labor hard." The earth is not just, you're not just going to go out and plant seed and the crop comes up. The earth will bear thorns and thistles. And you'll have to go out and overcome those obstacles. You'll have to chop down the thorns and the thistles to make room for the crop you've planted. Because if you don't chop down the thorns and thistles, they'll choke out the crop and you won't have anything to eat. So you're going to have to labor by the sweat of your brow day in and day out, trying to get rid of the obstacles that get in your way. Just to give room for what you planted to come up and to bear fruit. You're going to labor. You're going to labor. And you're going to do this just to have something to eat. And you're going to do it day in and day out. And finally, you're going to die and you're going to go back to the dust. The very dust you've been laboring in. Jesus Christ said, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden." You got a heavy burden. I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you'll find rest unto your souls. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. See, when people talk about God's law being a harsh yoke, they don't even begin to understand what they're talking about. Sin is a harsh yoke. Christ said, "My yoke is easy, my burden is light." It's a whole lot easier to do it the right way. Take my yoke. Learn of me. I'm meek and lowly in heart. You'll find rest. You'll find relief. That's what Jesus Christ came offering. Notice back in Psalm 55. Psalm 55, verse 22. "Cast your burden upon the Lord, and He shall sustain you. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved." What do you do with the heavy load? You know, we go through life, and we carry heavy loads, consequences that we have. It may be in our family. It may be various trials and tests and difficulties and adversities that we may face. We're told, "Cast your burden upon the Lord, and He will sustain you." Peter expresses it a little differently. He says, "Casting all your cares on Him, for He cares for you." You see, we don't have to go through life on our own. We don't have to carry the load by our own strength. Cast your burden upon the Lord. He'll sustain you. Jesus Christ said, if you're heavy laden, you're just burdened down, come to me. Give me the load. Let me carry it. Now, what does fasting have to do with all of this? Well, let's go back to Isaiah 58. Isaiah 58, verse 1. "Cry aloud, spare not, lift up your voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgressions, and the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily, and delight to know my ways as a nation that did righteousness, and forsook not the ordinance of their God. They ask of me the ordinances of justice." They take delight in approaching God. Oh, they like to talk about God. They like to talk about being religious. Verse 3, "Wherefore have we fasted, say they, and you don't see? Wherefore have we afflicted our soul, and you take no knowledge?" Here's the answer. "Behold, in the day of your fast you find pleasure, and exact all your labors. Behold, you fast for strife and debate, and to smite with the fist of wickedness. You shall not fast as you do this day to make your voice to be heard on high." We fast to make our voice to be heard on high, but how do we fast? "Is it not such a fast that I have chosen," verse 5, "a day for a man to afflict his soul? Is it to bow down his head as a bulrush, to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this a fast and an acceptable day to the Lord? Is it simply to go through the outward motions and trappings?" Verse 6, "Is not this the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, that you break every yoke." You see, the fast that God has chosen is a fast that is intended to change our lives. A fast that is to loose the bands of wickedness, to loose the bands that tie us to wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens that we carry, to let the oppressed go free, that you break every yoke. Jesus Christ said, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you." Is it not, verse 7, to deal your bread to the hungry, that you bring the poor that are cast out to your house? When you see the naked, that you cover him, that you hide not yourself from your own flesh? Then shall your light break forth as the morning, and your health shall spring forth speedily, and your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear reward. Then shall you call, and the Lord shall answer. Then you shall cry, and he shall say, Here I am. If you take away from the midst of you the yoke, the putting of the finger, the speaking vanity, draw out your soul to the hungry, and satisfy the afflicted soul, then shall your light rise in obscurity, and your darkness be as the noonday. And the Lord shall guide you continually, and satisfy your soul in drought, and make fat your bones. You shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water, whose waters fail not. You see, the fast that God has chosen is a fast that is to result in a change of life. Getting rid of the putting forth of the finger, the accusative attitude. Getting rid of the putting forth of the finger, the speaking of vanity. Rather, to have an attitude of giving and serving and helping, of helping others. Loosing the bands of wickedness, undoing the heavy burdens, breaking the yoke. You see, the fast that God is after is a fast that will cause us to examine ourselves, to look for that which yokes us to sin, to look for that which binds us to wickedness, to look for what is the source of oppression, to look for the things in our lives that separate us from God, that interfere in that relationship. God's not way off that he can't hear or see, but sin gets between us and God. Fasting is a tool to be accompanied with self-examination, to examine our lives, to examine ourselves, to see what it is in our lives that needs to be broken free of. Fasting is a tool to break those bands, to break that yoke. Notice on over just a couple of pages in Isaiah 61. Isaiah 61, a prophecy of Jesus Christ. We're going to see in just a few minutes how that was fulfilled. In Isaiah 61, verse 1, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Eternal has anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all that mourn, to appoint unto them that mourn in Zion, to give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they might be called trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he might be glorified." You see, good tidings, good news. The gospel was to be preached. This would involve binding up the brokenhearted, those that are crushed in mind and spirit, those that are discouraged and down, to proclaim liberty to the captives. What was to occur at the time when the Jubilee came in? The trumpet was to be sounded on the Day of Atonement, to proclaim liberty throughout the land. Liberty was to be proclaimed on the Day of Atonement. Jesus Christ is coming to proclaim here, to proclaim liberty to the captives, the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, the Jubilee, so to proclaim the day of vengeance of our God and to comfort all that mourn. It's a time of judgment. You know, back a little earlier in the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 27, in verse 13, "It shall come to pass in that day that the great trumpet shall be blown, and they shall come which were ready to perish in the land of Assyria and the outcast in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mount of Jerusalem. The trumpet of the Jubilee to proclaim liberty is going to be sounded on the Day of Atonement after Jesus Christ returns. And the captives in the concentration camps of the future are going to be set free, and they're going to be regathered to the land of Israel, to the inheritance given their forebears. The land will come back into the possession of those to whom it was originally given and intended. The trumpet will be sounded. The last trump of the seven will be sounded on the Feast of Trumpets, signaling the return of Jesus Christ. But that's not the only trumpet that's going to be sounded, just those first seven, because on the Day of Atonement, the trumpet of the Jubilee is going to be sounded, and liberty is going to be proclaimed throughout all the land. Because remember, Leviticus 25 tells us that was to be sounded on the 10th day of the seventh month. It was to be, liberty is to be proclaimed throughout all the land. Christ is going to proclaim that liberty, the opening prison to those that are bound. They're going to be freed from their captivity. They're going to be brought back. They're going to be restored. You see, Jesus Christ is going to send a great angel down to grab hold of Satan the devil, to take him to that wilderness desolate area that's described in Revelation 18. If you want to know where the great abyss is going to be, just read a couple of chapters earlier. Babylon the Great is fallen, and is what? Become the hold of every foul spirit. That's where they're going to be bound up, because if you read of the destruction, it's just going to be a crater. Just going to be a big hole in the ground. And that's where they're going to be brought. Going to be put in that wilderness, that desolate area. Well, you see, that sets the stage. I don't think we can fully understand what a difference it'll make for Satan not to be around, how much difference that makes in our world. But if you want to understand the difference, read Revelation 20. He is put away for 1,000 years. And the result is you have the millennium. You have a time of peace and prosperity and abundance. He's turned loose at the end of the 1,000 years for a little season. And as soon as he gets turned loose, the millennium is over. Next thing you know, he's got people stirred up all over the world, and they're coming up, to the holy city. If you want to know what a difference the devil makes, just read Revelation 20 and find out it. All that has to be done is he's just turned loose for a short time. A little season, it says. Doesn't say how long. Turn loose for a little season, and before you know it, he's got trouble stirred up everywhere. That's incredible. But you see, the author of sin is going to be removed, the source of the bands of wickedness, of the yoke of oppression. He's going to be put away. Jesus Christ paid the penalty for sin. Jesus Christ came. Notice here in Luke 4. We just got through reading in Isaiah 61. Now let's go to Luke 4. Luke 4, verse 1. Jesus, being full of the Holy Spirit, returned from Jordan, was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. 40 days he was tempted of the devil. And then, as we come on down a little further, verse 14, he returned in the power of the Spirit into Galilee. And there went out a fame of him through all the region round about. And he taught in their synagogues, being glorified of all. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And there was delivered unto him the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he opened the book, he found the place where it was written, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, the recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. And he closed the book. Jesus Christ came announcing that good news. He came fulfilling those things, making it possible for the brokenhearted to be healed, for the captives to be delivered. Opening up of sight, to be able to see and understand. Making possible liberty. You and I can partake of that right now. You know, if the Son has made you free, then are you free indeed. Jesus Christ came proclaiming liberty. And when He returns to this earth and puts Satan away, He's going to proclaim liberty to the whole world. Because the one who is the enslaver of mankind is going to be put away. The enslavement of mankind began in Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve yielded to Satan instead of God. God's way leads to freedom and liberty. Satan's way leads to pain and suffering and enslavement. You know, when you look at the state that the world is in, when you look at the pain and the sorrow that govern the lives of people, you look at the hard labor, you look at the difficulties of life, and you realize that every bit of that goes back to the Garden of Eden. It goes back to the fact that Adam and Eve made a fateful decision that has been followed by their descendants, of yielding to Satan and following the pulls, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And our whole world and society has been built upon that. There's a new world coming that's going to be built on something entirely different, because this world and the lust thereof is going to pass away, and he that does the will of God shall abide forever. Let's notice in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Second Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 21. He, God, has made Him, Christ, to be sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in Him. Christ took our place. He died in our stead. He became sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in Him, that we might undergo a change and transformation. You know, when we look at the culmination of the plan of God, we look back in Revelation chapter 21. And John saw the vision of a new heavens and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away. And there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and He will dwell with them, and they shall be His people, and God Himself shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. And there shall be no more death. Adam and Eve were told, In the day you eat thereof, you shall surely die. Satan lied to them. He told them they wouldn't, but they did. And death has passed upon all men. Death came into the world by sin, and death has passed upon all men, for all have sinned. The time is coming when God Himself shall be here. God will wipe away all tears. There will be no more death, no more sorrow, nor crying. You go back to Genesis 3, and God told Eve, In sorrow you shall bring forth children. He told Adam, In sorrow you shall till the ground from whence you came. The time is coming when there will be no more sorrow, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And He that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And He said unto me, Write, for these things are true and faithful. He said unto me, It is done. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give unto him that is athirst of the fountain of the water of life freely. He that overcomes shall inherit all things, and I'll be his God, and he'll be my son. God has a plan and a purpose. Let's notice, finally, here in Romans chapter 8. We're here on the Day of Atonement, a day that looks forward to the completion of the reconciliation of all mankind with God. Liberty being proclaimed, the enslaver of man being put away. Romans chapter 8. Paul says in verse 18, I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation waits for the manifestation of the sons of God. The creation was made subject to vanity, subject to being temporary, to passing away. It was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who has subjected the same in hope. because the creation itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. This day looks forward to liberty being proclaimed throughout all the earth. Satan, the enslaver, being put away. Liberty being proclaimed. The whole world restored to fellowship, relationship, harmony with God. That which separates man and God removed. And the one who instigated that separation removed. The creation itself will be delivered from the bondage of corruption, the bondage of decay, which is the result of sin. Be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. Brethren, we have a foretaste of that liberty right now. A relationship with our Creator and our elder brother. We're here on a day in which we are demonstrating to God our rejection of the rule of the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life in our life. Our acceptance of Him in His way, our desire for a relationship with Him. And we look forward to and anticipate the fulfillment of that time when the trumpet of the Jubilee will be blown and liberty will be proclaimed throughout the whole earth on the Day of Atonement in the years just ahead of us.